The National Archives is the official archive of the UK Government and England and Wales. We are home to the nation's stories and are the guardians of some of the world's most iconic historical documents, from Doomsday to Downing Street tweets. We believe that archives are for everyone because they are about everyone, past, present and future.
Good afternoon. My name is Kieran Wallace. I'm the co-director of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. I'll be facilitating today's talk, which is a collaboration between the National Archives and the Virtual Record Treasury. The Virtual Treasury is an international digital humanities project working to reconstruct the lost state collections of Ireland, which were destroyed when the Public Record Office of Ireland went up in flames in 1922. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. Today's event will last approximately 1 hour, finishing at 3 p.m. UK time. If you have any technical queries, please email our team at whatsom@nationalarchives.gov.uk and they will try to assist you. You can make use of live captioning throughout the talk. This can be enabled by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by historian Gillian O'Brien. Gillian is Professor of Public History at Liverpool John Moores University, and she's also the author of The Darkness Echoing, Ireland's Places of Famine, Death and Rebellion. This afternoon, Gillian will be introducing the history of Ireland in the 1800s by exploring the stories of lesser-known individuals who lived through famous episodes in the history of 19th century Ireland. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Kieran, and thanks to the Virtual Treasury and to everyone at the National Archives who have made this talk possible. And I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then have a Q&A afterwards. I listened last week to Neil Johnson's talk, and he had to cover about 300 years in those 40 minutes. I merely have to cover 1 century, but it is quite the century. And Neil very kindly left me the 1790s to deal with, which I'm very pleased about that I get to do a long 19th century. And really, I think that the 19th century in Ireland can really only be understood by including the tumultuous 1790s. So I want to begin from a slightly odd place. This is a shot from a museum in Fukuoka in Japan, and it's about where history is more than books, which seems an odd thing to talk about when you're looking at an archive. I prefer to think of it in some ways as history being more than words. And I used to be very immersed and steeped in official records, but I've since moved quite away from them, in part because very often sort of the official records tell one version of a story, often the official story, which often tells the stories of the elite and excludes the ordinary people. But I think over the last number of decades, places like the National Archives and the Virtual Treasury, they've been taking and pulling out of them, those archives, some of the stories of more ordinary people. And I say ordinary people in inverted commas. And so when I had sort of had my fill of official papers, I began to leave the archive and to focus on objects, paintings, landscape and buildings, and using them alongside what you find within the archives themselves, in an attempt to tell kind of broader stories than the traditional big men of history stories that many of us would have grown up with in school. I like digging around sort of the obvious in order to try and find things that might cast a different light on what has been traditionally understood. So when Kieran asked me to do this and I had accepted, I then began to really struggle with where to start, what to focus on, given the riches at my fingertips, just sitting at the computer and logging on to the Virtual Treasury. And so what I've done is decided to dip into the 19th century, or the long 19th century, around topics that I do research on and topics that I find fascinating, in the hope of inspiring some of you to spend time searching the Treasury yourselves, or possibly suggesting a different way at looking at things that we may have all seen before. So I said I'm going to avoid big men, but here's a whole slide full of big men of history. The history of 19th century Ireland was dominated by big events, big men, and big problems. From the Union in 1800 to increasing religious divisions, the growth of nationalism, 3 rebellions, 1803, 1848, 1867, famine, emigration, death, land war, home rule. It was quite the century. The traditional telling of it focuses on these big men stories. Men such as Robert Emmet, Daniel O'Connell, Charles Stewart, Parnell, all loom large over popular understanding of the century. And for anyone who is interested in who these particular big men are, going from the top left-hand corner there and moving across, Daniel O'Connell, Robert Emmet, Father Theobald Matthew, Cardinal Paul Cullen, John Mitchell, Michael Davitt, Charles Stewart Parnell, John Devoy, Thomas Francis Marr, Charles Trevelyan. I had to put an Englishman in, which had such a key role to play in the famine, and finally Thomas Davis. Now, having introduced them, I'm going to try and largely ignore them for the next 35 minutes or so, or mention them slightly in tangential ways. My research career began first examining the United Irishman and the Northern Star newspaper, and then moving on to look at Anglo-Irish relations and high politics around the 1798 rebellion and the Active Union. And many of those archives and collections that I sat in archives, about the National Archives in Ireland, the National Archives in London, though what I was reading there now forms part of the virtual record treasury. The rebellion papers, chief secretary papers, newspapers, they're all digitized and at your fingertips. And for that, I'm very jealous of anyone beginning their research now in those ways. And I was reminded of this great quote from W.E.H. Lecky, writing his History of Ireland in the late 19th century. And he wrote about the rebellion papers, about this great mass of serious, formal and depressing documents. There may be found others of a very different character, which were seized among the papers of the conspirators, and which have sometimes a strangely pathetic interest. There are love letters and rude poems, passionate expressions of youthful friendships, notebooks in which eager scholars described their studies or recorded their passing thoughts, daydreams of young and ardent natures, too often destined to end in exile or the gallows. And I think in this, Lecky is using the term pathetic, meaning evoking emotion, as it would have been used in the 19th century, not the more modern sort of negative connotations. And it's those love letters and rude poems and passionate expressions that always attracted my attention more so than kind of the serious, formal and depressing documents. And so you will find all of those sort of things in the virtual treasury, and which is full of gems if you search around. I want to begin really with the Northern Star newspaper. It's the beginning of my research journey, but it's also now available through digitized archives. The Northern Star newspaper was one of the most significant publications of the 1790s. It was founded by leading United Irishmen in Belfast and published between 1792 and 1797. It was largely edited by Samuel Neilson, the man you see on the right-hand side. He had made his money as a woolen draper in Belfast. And this paper was a consistent object of suspicion by the authorities, who objected to its content. It was very keen on Tom Paine, the French Revolution, and the United Irishmen. And they really feared its extensive circulation. And within the rebellion papers, there are these journey books of the Northern Star newspaper. And the journey books were an absolute treasure trove. They are an absolute treasure trove. This one is from March 1793. And they outline the distribution networks of the newspaper. They show the accounts, money that was collected, money that was spent on the purchase of things like horseshoes and bridles by the men journeying around to collect the dues. But they also have these great little insights into sort of the more mundane, or more sort of giving you an insight into people living at the time. And I love these two records from this March 1793 journey book. One which says the paper was published one of the subscribers says the paper was published more than a month ago before he got it. Therefore, as he does not like the paper, it is to be sent no more to him. followed by Mr. Adam from Moira, County Down, asks the newspaper to discontinue his paper. His father-in-law won't let him read it any longer. And I really would love to know what was the relationship between Mr. Adam and his father-in-law that had him ban the Northern Star. So you get these sort of small snippets, but they spark sort of a wondering about family relations and various other things. The paper was ultimately closed in May of 1797 when members of the Monaghan militia destroyed the paper's printing press. The Monaghan militia had been infiltrated by the United Irishmen. Some members of the militia were very publicly executed because of that membership. And the destruction of the Northern Star paper was largely revenge and to show the militia's loyalty to the Crown. And in this letter, which Thomas Pelham, who was the Chief Secretary of Ireland, wrote to an anonymous correspondent in November of 1797, he writes, "The destruction of the Northern Star at Belfast and the attack upon Mr. Gregg's house by the soldiers of the Monaghan militia are outrages not to be justified and were punished. At the same time, when it is recollected that the Monaghan was reckoned the most loyal regiment in Ireland before it went to Belfast, that owing to the spirit of Colonel Leslie, who was the commander of the regiment, the conspiracy was discovered. It is not to be wondered at that the regiment should feel an indignation at the printers of that paper, which had been industriously circulated amongst them and had corrupted so many of their comrades, as well as the whole province of Ulster." And then he goes on to say, "Mr. Gregg's in himself perhaps a harmless man, but his sisters were notorious encouragers of the United Irishmen and had sent liquor and money to the Monaghan militiamen who were confined." And again, what I love about this is that he says that the Monaghan militia had overstepped the mark and that they were punished. And then in the next line, he justifies why they might have done so. And where he talks about Mr. Gregg, what is really interesting to me there is the mention of Mr. Gregg's sisters, because it is very difficult to get a full sense of the involvement and role of women in the United Irishmen. And it's by looking at letters like this that you get that sort of insight into what was going on at the time. The image on the right-hand side there is not digitized and part of the collection. I used it to kind of give a sense of what Belfast looked like in the 1790s. It is of the White Linen Hall in Belfast, which was on the site of the current City Hall. And it's a much more recent drawing of the late 19th century. It was drawn towards the end of the 20th century. This letter here is from 1798, about the 1798 rebellion. It's written by General Gerard Lake. And the reason that I chose this letter is because I spent many days close to tears reading the originals, because General Gerard Lake's writing is almost indecipherable. And anyone now who wants to look at it gets to look at a lot of the transcribed letters, which is a great joy. No one will be forced into weeping in the way I was. General Gerard Lake was the commander of the forces of the Crown during the 1798 rebellion. And in this letter to Lord Castlereagh, writing from Wexford, which was where the centre of the rebellion was by June 1798, just at the very tail end of that rebellion, he writes, "This country will soon be settled, as I believe the lower order of people are heartily sick of the business and are abusing their leaders most completely, and will bring in their arms in a day or two. In short, I have every reason to hope that a few days will settle the business here. I have taken Hay, one of their commanders, yesterday. He will be tried this evening and most probably executed. If I hear of any assembly of men, you may depend upon their having a complete drubbing, but I strongly suspect they will not try the chance of another. The carnage yesterday was dreadful. The rascals made a tolerable good fight of it." And his use of that sort of term rascals is very dismissive of the rebellions. What's interesting there is where he talks about having taken Hay, who will be tried, and his assumption that Hay will be found guilty and then executed. The Hay in question is very likely to be Edward Hay, who was indeed arrested, tried, but actually acquitted, who later wrote a book around the rebellion. This is Edward Cook is one of my favourite correspondents, because he casts great light on the workings of Dublin Castle, but he's also an inveterate gossip in many ways. He was an undersecretary at Dublin Castle, which essentially made him a permanent civil servant. So politicians came and went, but Edward Cook kind of remained there with an oversight of what was going on. And in this letter, he writes to William Wickham, who was Under Secretary of State for Home Department. So essentially his equal in a different respect, in different department. And he's writing about events in Dublin just before the 1798 rebellion happens. And he writes, he, Allen, was apprentice, or rather shopman, to Mr. Shannon, a woolen draper of Castle Street in this town, the town being Dublin. He was active, regular and honest. About 8 weeks ago, he was out all night, and the next day he wrote a letter to his master saying that from the perfidy of his friends he was forced to fly. Mr. Shannon has not heard of him. The real cause of his flight is said to be a murder committed by him in Kevin Street. A riot had taken place at Astley's Theatre on the United Irishmen opposing the playing of God Save the King. Kelly was one of the leaders of the Loyal Party. He was pursued from the theatre and murdered in Kevin Street. Graves, a scene painter at Astley, who was now in Liverpool or in London, saw the murder committed and on Kelly's death gave examinations before the coroner and is bound to prosecute. If you sent for Graves, he will probably identify Allen. And again, the story about that particular murder and the fact that it takes place in the aftermath of a theatre show is really interesting. This image is not of Astley's amphitheatre in Dublin, but it's of Astley's amphitheatre in London. Philip Astley is very often thought of as sort of the founder of circuses in Britain and in Ireland. He had a huge amphitheatre in London, and then he comes over and he opens one in Dublin. And so mostly what he put on were circus acts, but he always played God Save the King. And he was known for his loyalty to Dublin Castle. And so increasingly in the 1790s, United Irishmen and those who were Irish nationalists or Republicans would go to try and disrupt the performances. And so this is an account of how sort of the theatre became kind of embroiled in the politics of the day, ultimately resulting in this murder. And you get an insight into it from Edward Cook's letter. And it's really the only kind of real insight we get into what happened and that particular event. Edward Cook covers everything. He covers murders outside theatres. He also writes about probably the most important act that influences what happens through 19th century Ireland. The Act of Union passed in 1800, which absolutely dominates the 19th century by people either wanting to keep the Act of Union, the joining of Britain and Ireland, or to get rid of it. And Edward Cook writes a letter to John King, another Undersecretary at the Home Office, reporting the passage of the Act of Union. And he writes, the Union Bill passed at 10 tonight in the House of Commons in Dublin. Some violent speeches from lawyers. Soon after, William Conyngham Plunkett rose and talked of the villainy of government. The House grew violent. The galleries were cleared. Plunkett continued violent and called on his friends to secede. About 2/3 of the opposition left the House in a body. Many very respectable characters remained, who explained their sentiments and reasons for not seceding. The bill was then passed. It is a great day over, and all things considered over well. Dublin is quiet. And you get a real kind of sense, he spans a huge range, and his personal papers do not exist that anyone has ever come across, but a huge sort of collection of his papers are available in a number of different archives of his letters to and from other, for the most part, other kind of professional civil servants. And I want to move to a very different type of piece of archive material. These are secretly taken notes of overheard conversations between two men who were being held in Kilmainham Jail in 1803, in the aftermath of Robert Emmet's failed rebellion. And they're being held there in November of 1803. The rebellion is over. Robert Emmet has been arrested and he has been executed along with a number of other people involved. And the two men who are involved in this conversation, one is a man called Philip Long, who was a wealthy merchant in Dublin, who had given Emmet quite a lot of funding, which helped organise or pay for the organisation of the 1803 rebellion. And the second man is a man called James Tandy. James Tandy is not terribly well known, but he's the son of James Napper Tandy, who was very well known in Dublin as a United Irishman and as someone who was largely regarded as someone who was going to foment rebellion. James Tandy was very close to his father, but he didn't necessarily hold the same political beliefs. He ends up, however, in prison, suspected of involvement in the 1803 rebellion, an involvement he didn't have. And I love this secret transcript, or most secret transcript, where Long says, "They are making a great fuss about a bill with Emmet's name on the back. I don't believe you knew him. Tandy: No, I never met him in my life. Long: He was a man whose word could not be depended on. He owes me a great deal of money, that is the fact, a shilling of which I'm sure I shall never get," which is certainly true because Emmet at this point had been executed. Tandy: I suppose not. What in the name of God could have induced you to have given your sanction to such a business, which even if it had succeeded, must inevitably have ended in your own destruction, which I could never have believed before. Long: By God, the fact is that I've been made quite the dupe of in a pack of rascals. I do not care how soon they execute me. I am quite tired of life. The conversation takes up the next day, where Long says to Tandy, "The doctor had a long conversation with me this day. I am to get a larger room. Pray, was I not very tipsy last night when I was speaking to you?" Tandy responds, "Oh no." So I love this idea of where he was tired of life, that clearly they'd had drink. And I like the idea that it gives you a sense that you can get alcohol in Kilmainham jail at the time, which we know to very definitely be the case, that you could quite easily get things smuggled in and out. Tandy goes very rapidly from thinking he's quite happy to be executed to sobering up and absolutely not wanting to be executed. In both cases, both men were ultimately released, having been found not guilty, but neither of them finds that their merchant careers are returned to the success they'd had before their arrest. And I want to move from text-based material to images. I love using images, but we can't assume that they are entirely accurate, in the same way as we can't assume that text is entirely accurate. It's always going to be one person's perspective rather than, necessarily exactly the truth. But I think melding the use of the images alongside text can be very helpful. They're really great at helping to visualize the past, the buildings, the streets, the fashions. This particular image is by James Malton, who I guess is very often seen on placemats for sale in places like Carroll's, but whose images, while not always absolutely accurate, are really important for an understanding of late 18th century Dublin. But rather, I don't want to be accused of being too Dublin-centric, so I'm going to move very briefly to Cork and to look at this cartouche from a map of the county of Cork from 1811. And I love cartouches, which very often appear near where the label of a map is, who it was, why it was commissioned, who it was for, and often what it was about. And the images, the cartouches, often are descriptive of what the map is trying to show. And so in this map, you are getting a real sense, and this cartouche, you're getting a real sense of the hustle and bustle in the port and on the quays of Cork. It's an image that I've used as a jumping off point to tell a very complicated city about Cork, about the city, the port, emigration, slavery, and religion. And because in this, if you look closely at it, you can see there are barrels, boxes, and parcels being loaded onto the ships, which are visible in the background. Merchants negotiate a contract over a barrel, while a prosperous-looking man converses with two others. Around them, men carry provisions, two of them using a shoulder pole to hoist their barrel towards the ships. Piecing together Cork's mercantile and provisions trade is very challenging because very little source material survives. But this cartouche, married with other sources, gives us a real sense of the significance of the port and of trade for the city. From as far back as the 1650s, beef, butter, and related products, including hides, skins, and tallow, formed a really important part of the Atlantic trade. In a text that largely functioned as a guide for the purchasing and running of plantations, published at the very end of the 18th century, Brian Edwards offered advice to those considering establishing a sugar plantation and highlighted the importance of obtaining provisions from Ireland. Edwards estimated that a plantation of 600 acres with 250 enslaved people would need to purchase substantial provisions from Ireland, including 80 barrels of herring or salted cod, 6 barrels of salted beef, 2 barrels of salted pork, 4 firkins of salted butter, 2 boxes of soap, 2 boxes of candles, 2 hogsheads of salt, 6 barrels of flour. And they were all coming from Cork. By the early 1770s, over half of the top exporters of butter and beef from Cork were Catholic merchants, and Cork was dominating that particular trade. Irish Catholic families owned plantations in the West Indies. For example, the Chute family had arrived to the West Indies from Ireland in the 1690s. Richard Chute was one of the very few Irish planters who owned ships that he used to import provisions from Cork in exchange for sugar, tobacco, and indigo. By 1760, one of his sons, Nicholas, was well established in St. Croix, which is now part of the US Virgin Islands, where he owned 7 plantations and had an interest in 14 others. Nicholas Chute maintained very strong family and trade connections to Cork. Indeed, one of his daughters, Elizabeth Chute, was sent to Cork for her education and became a boarder at the Ursuline convent in the city. According to contemporary records, she had a gilded youth and as a petted young lady been tended by slaves. But she didn't re-embrace that life of privilege when she left school. Instead, in 1824, she became Sister Aloysius when she joined the Presentation Convent in Doneraile, County Cork. And in 1853, she became one of the founders of the convent in Mitchelstown, again in County Cork. Oh, I seem to have lost the slide. Let me see. I think it might be back up and running. What's interesting about that is you can take that one cartouche and then use it to kind of extrapolate a lot more from it. Moving back to Dublin, this is a view of Dublin from the Customs House from 1817 by Samuel Brockus. And you can see the Custom House there on the right-hand side. And there are 2 areas that I'm particularly interested in that you might overlook. So you can see the top part there is the very back of that image. On the left-hand side, you can see the spire of St. Patrick's Cathedral. If you look down below that, you can see the dome of what is now City Hall, was the Royal Exchange. But if you move right over to just beside the forecourt, you can also see a windmill. And this may come as a surprise to many people that Dublin had windmills at the time. This windmill, part of it still remains because it was the windmill that was used in Rose Distillery in the Liberties. And so it's sort of an unusual thing to see. I'm also really like this in the foreground where you see sort of the range of boats that are on the Liffey, small boats, big boats, but you can also see on the quays, you can see kegs there, you can see all sorts of barrels, you can see how busy the area around the Custom House was and how far ships can go up the Liffey at that time, because ships that size can certainly not go up the Liffey that far today. So there's, you get all sorts of gems by looking closely at these sort of images. This is a Malton print from the late 1790s, and it's a print of Capel Street in Dublin, looking up over Essex Bridge and on towards City Hall, or as it is today. And what I really like about this print is the sense of the city living, being a living space. There you get some great late 18th century shop fronts there. You get to see sort of this style of people, from the poor man begging with the man on the horse to the fashions of the women on the left. And one of the really interesting things I always find about Malton's prints is there are always dogs in them. Very often they look like domesticated dogs. Sometimes they look like they're roaming free. And if you look right at the far right-hand side, you'll see a man up a ladder, on the bridge, up a ladder. So you get a lamplighter or someone who's involved in sort of the preservation of those lamps on the bridge. And it is a section from this bigger Malton print. And so I think these always bear, and particularly now that these are digitized, you can zoom in on your screen and see them in really high resolution and get all sorts of kind of details that you might not have otherwise seen without the use of a magnifying glass. And this slide here, what I'm showing you here are extracts from 2 views of the forecourts, one looking down the River Liffey, one looking up the River Liffey. So you can see this is a section from this print, and then you can just about see it if I'm not blocking the way. So you're looking at the same side of the Liffey. You're seeing people on both sides. In one of them, they're looking quite well to do. You can see merchants, you can see horses, you can see carriages, you can see people walking right along the edge. And in the other, it looks poverty stricken. And yet these are all within a couple of 100 meters of each other. And so which of these are we to believe to be true, or could both possibly be true? One of them is by Brockus, the one on the left. The second one is sometimes deemed to be by Brockus, but I think it's actually by Thomas Sotol Roberts and not by Brockus himself. One of them is but one on the right is from near the Coal Quay. The bridge that's broken there was destroyed in 1802, and it's where a flower market, and you can see sort of the remnants of that flower market. But I love that you can bring two prints that are, were created within a decade or so of each other, showing almost identical space, but you can see clearly differences between them. And somewhere in the midst of that, you'll find kind of an accurate account of what life may or may not have been like in the city, and you can add to that what we know through the written record and various other records. This is a particular gem. This is a record from the 1821 census, and painstaking work by the staff of the virtual record treasury to recover what remains of this 1821 census is simply remarkable, because for many years we thought almost all of it had been destroyed. I mean, almost all of it had, but slowly other pieces of that 1821 census are, reappearing and being held in one place, which is an absolute joy. For the most part, the records that now exist of the 1821 census are reliant on replacement records of where individuals prior to 1922, when the Public Record Office was destroyed by fire, individuals could request copies of particular 1821 records. Many of these are in private collections. By private collections, we often mean attics, where nobody has any idea that they're actually there. It sounds much more grand to say it's in a private collection. Some, though, have been donated to libraries and archives. This one here was originally ordered by Thomas Carani on the 9th of November 1915. It's an 1821 census return from the townland of Ballyholen in County Sligo, and it lists the names, ages and occupations of the Naughton family, John, Anne and their 7 sons aged 1 to 22. It's also signed right down at the very bottom by Herbert Wood, who was the deputy keeper of the records at the time of the 1922 fire. So it has sort of multiple layers of meaning, which I think makes this a particularly interesting record. I like little more than a good will. And these are two very good wills. One of them is from over 4,000 wills made by Irish people, which were registered with the probate court in Canterbury. And you can search for them on the virtual treasury and then find the link and download it from the National Archives. So the one on the bottom is a detail from Mary Golding's will. And I really like this will because most of those that she's listing to inherit are women. And she's very precise. I love the detail that she gives in her will. And I'm not going to look at the whole will, but just read a little section from it. Mary Golding, widow of the late James Golding of the city of Dublin. I give and bequeath unto my granddaughter, Mary Sally Golding, my gold watch and 1 brooch, and 1 ring to my nephew, Thomas Adding, and to my niece, Sarah Tumble, 1 brooch and 1 ring in a box marked for her. And I give and bequeath all my wearing apparel to the said Mary Sally Golding and Sarah Trumbull, to be equally divided between them. Also I give and bequeath the several pecuniary legacies to the said Mary Sally Golding, £400, to the said Sarah Trumbull, £50, to my sister Susan Queen, £10, to my sister Jenny Loft, £10. And she goes on with these sort of smaller amounts of money. So her granddaughter is doing very well. She's getting a gold watch, 1 brooch, the vast majority of her wealth. But what I like is that she has chosen very carefully about how to divide it out. She lists it, it goes on and on. It's a very long will, but that she's primarily leaving things to family members who are women, not family members who are male. And that makes it an interesting will to me. I also love, for very different reasons, this will of Hugh Brady of Oldcastle, County Meath. Hugh Brady wanted no fuss. No fuss at his wedding, at his funeral. However, his will, if you read it, says he wants to be interred at Moyloch in County Meath without parade or ostentation. Bear his lack of parade and ostentation in mind. He wants his coffin to be of plain deal wood, painted black and carried on men's shoulders. My executor is to buy 325 yards of linen, not under 10 pence or over 12 pence per yard, and given to each of the poorest men of the parishes of Oldcastle, Lough Crew, and Munterconnacht and Calais. 3.5 yards thereof as a scarf to be worn at my funeral, to be walked in pairs behind my corpse. Bear in mind, no parade, no ostentation, but he's got 100 men, at least, marching behind his coffin. No person possessed of a cow shall have any part of my linen, and only 3 priests shall attend, they being my brother, my nephew, John Riley, and Father Blank, besides the parish priest, of course. So 4 priests and 100 people marching behind this unostentatious funeral. The parish priest is to get 1 guinea, and I request there should be no month's mind, knowing that my friends will offer their prayers. So I just love this idea of the poor of Oldcastle being, if they want a scarf, they have to go and march behind Hugh Brady's coffin. I said that I wasn't going to really look at any of the big men of history. I'm making one exception to talk a little bit about Daniel O'Connell. I'm doing this partly because this is the 250th anniversary of Daniel O'Connell's birth. So I've included him for that reason alone. This is a handwritten note from the Lord Lieutenant Henry Paget, the first Marquess of Anglesey. It's a signed memorandum of a conversation he had with Daniel O'Connell in the end of July 1828. So it's after he was elected, after O'Connell was elected for County Clare, but before Catholic emancipation. And so Anglesey writes about him, he then, with much mark of respect and peculiar calmness and mildness of manner, expressed great regret at the unhappy state of the country, which he humbly suggested was kept up by the frequent and unnecessary interference of the police and by the Protestants being generally armed. He feared he might have been much misrepresented to me, that he was most anxious for the tranquillity of the country, that no effort should be wanting on his part to preserve it, that the Catholics were driven to the course they were now pursuing by the ungenerous treatment that they had received. Mr. O'Connell seemed extremely anxious to impress upon my mind his abhorrence of insurrection and his conviction that none must be expected. And that is very much in keeping of O'Connell ultimately being a pacifist and not wanting to be part of a physical force movement for Irish freedom. He concludes with, "My firm belief is that O'Connell is perfectly sincere. I should be laughed at for my gullibility, but I repeat that I believe him sincere, that he has a good heart and means well, and means indeed always what he says, but that he is volatile and unsteady and so vain that he cannot resist momentary applause." I think this is a very good description of, many politicians, that they mean well, but may also be so vain that they cannot resist momentary applause. And the last sort of significant story that I want to look at is the story of Captain John McCafferty. Captain John McCafferty, who you see on the right-hand side, was a US citizen born in Ohio. And he was tried in Ireland, in Cork, tried actually more than once for treason felony. But he was first tried in December of 1865. John McCafferty was a Fenian. He travelled from the United States to Ireland with the aim of participating in an armed rebellion. He was an interesting character, and for a short time he was a significant player in the Irish nationalist and Republican movement. Like many of those who promoted Irish nationalism, he had played a part in the American Civil War. However, unlike the majority of Irishmen involved in the Civil War, McCafferty joined the Confederate Army. At the end of the war, he took the amnesty oath and soon thereafter left New York. He arrived at what was then Queenstown, it is now Cove, on a ship called the City of Limerick in September of 1865. The Freeman's Journal newspaper reported that after other passengers had disembarked the steamship, the local police boarded it and found in the possession of an American who gave his name as Robinson McCafferty. McCafferty had a number of aliases through his life. They found on him a number of documents said to be of treasonable nature. He was also found to be in possession of a number of firearms. He was around 25 years old, and he was described by the Cork Herald as rather tall with an intelligent cast of features, dark eyes and dark hair, which he wore long behind, with a slight beard and moustache after the fashion of his own countrymen. McCafferty was immediately brought before local magistrates and committed for trial. He was charged with treason felony and sent for trial at the Cork Special Commission, which opened amidst a strong military presence on the 14th of September, and his trial took place 2 days later. Now, one of the really interesting things, and you can see the full account of that trial is available through the virtual Treasury. He was represented at his trial by Isaac Butt. It was his legal representation. Isaac Butt goes on to become extremely well known and closely associated with the foundation of the Home Rule movement and the Irish Parliamentary Party. Butt's defence of McCafferty rested on the argument that as McCafferty was born in the United States, he owed no allegiance to the British Crown, and therefore he could not be guilty of treason. And on that technicality, he was acquitted, advised to leave Ireland, which he duly did. However, he did stay away, but not entirely from the Irish cause. He was later arrested for the attempted raid on the ammunition store at Chester in 1867, which was designed to begin the Fenian Rebellion of 1867. He was arrested and returned to Ireland, where he spent time in jail in Mountjoy and Kilmainham. He was tried again, this time also defended by Butt, but his defence was much less effective this time, and he was sentenced to death. However, like a lot of the Fenians of the time, this death sentence wasn't carried out, and he was released in 1871 as part of a general amnesty on condition that he returned to the United States. What I find fascinating about this story is that it has a little bit of everything. It is a story of Irish republicanism, of Irish Americans, of immigrants to the United States, of Ireland's connection to the Confederacy, which is very problematic in our telling of the story, of the emergence of a key figure in the Home Rule and Irish Parliamentary Party. It illustrates, I guess, in many ways, the clash ultimately between physical force nationalism and constitutionalism, where both of them, two figures in that clash, are on the same side of this particular story. And you've seen all of these images before, which I just re-included to give as a reminder of kind of the range of source material now available that give kind of insights into a very complicated century for Ireland. These are all tiny fragments, each one adding their tuppence worth to the big stories. Parts of maps, of letters. I love the kind of crossed out words that you find in Anglesy's account of his meeting with O'Connell, where he clearly thought about what he was going to write and then changed his mind. The census records putting individuals back into the story of the island. All of these things offer slightly different angles on events, on individuals, on motivations. They all are part of a complicated, complex, contradictory, messy history, which I think ultimately makes that history more interesting. So thank you for your time and for listening this afternoon.
So thank you very much, Gillian. That was absolutely fascinating. Just to remind people, you can put your questions into the Q&A and we'll feed them on to Gillian here. But there's one question that's been flowing in as you've been speaking, Gillian. So just to give you, the first one was a very minor clarification. When you were doing your introduction of the great men who you weren't going to talk about, you ran through the circle of men that were there. And one viewer was wondering, did you describe Thomas Davis as an Englishman? Whereas he actually was born in County Cork, but I think you were referring to Trevelyan.
I meant Trevelyan. Yes. No, I definitely would not claim a Cork man ever to be an Englishman.
Let's just clarify that was
yes, no, certainly Trevelyan being the only Englishman there.
Listener here, Warren is asking, do we know what happened to John McCafferty after his jail time? Did he actually return to the United States, and is there any record of his life there?
Yeah, he does return to the United States, and he's sort of more around the edges. he doesn't become ever a really key figure in what happens, and it's partly to do with the sort of whole split in that occurs in the Fenians at that time, where you split into Clan na Gael,
Yeah.
and he's sort of sidelined in that because he's not that important, and you've got people like John Devoy and Alexander Sullivan and others becoming kind of the big players.
Yeah.
He doesn't return to risk another trial of treason felony or being accused of it.
He's done his bit. One of the questions here, just I'll jump in on this one. Somebody's saying, how can we access documents in the virtual treasury? And if I may just jump in on this one and
Please
give you a
do.
chance to correct the rest. So the website is virtualtreasury.ie. So virtualtreasury.ie. And in there, you'll find thousands of TNA records and records from our other partner archives and libraries around Britain, around Ireland, and around the world. So do jump in and have a look and see what you can find. There's a question here. So sorry, just jumped into the desk there. The question about has there been a request to local communities? This is from the virtual treasury. A request to local communities to see if they have any historical records suitable for inclusion. And again, I'll take this one, Gillian. So just to say that we do speak with local communities all the time. We give talks to local libraries and county libraries, and some records have come to us in that way. We don't take any physical records. So in the way we deal with, for instance, our partners in the National Archives in Kew, similarly with county record offices and county archives, if people have records, they can donate them or deposit them physically with the archive, and then we would deal with the archive on the digital image basis. We just get a digital image. So please don't send us any things. Getting a question here, can we suggest where court records in civil cases for County Cork may reside for the 1850s and 60s? Have you any view on that, like court records in general, Gillian? I know some are available on some of the commercial genealogy websites, like Petty Sessions Courts are available.
Yeah, I was going to say the Petty Sessions Courts are available sort of commercially. The Cork Archive itself, they have a collections. I think you've been
That's right,
they're
the
one of
Cork.
your partners. So some of those will obviously be digitized. Cork, if you look at their own website, which you can access through Cork County Council's website, they are going through a process of digitizing. I'm not sure how many of those court records are digitized, but over through COVID, they digitized a huge amount. And Brian, who's the archivist there, is very helpful and will be able to point you in the direction if they're not already digitized. But as you said, they're also available on some commercial. And those records there, the McCafferty case, they're all on the virtual treasury.
So this is it. So it's in the nature of things, because records have been scattered. They were all once together in the Public Record Office. Once it was destroyed, we're trying to trace down the scattered remnants. So it is very often the case that these are dispersed. Just speaking of archival tragedies like 1922, Cork City Courthouse burnt down, I think, in the 1880s, losing a whole tranche of court records. So again, the random survival of things. The question here, I think you mentioned this is to you, Gillian. You mentioned you like to use images, etc., in your research. How do you integrate using those kinds of sources with documents or other sources in your research? I think that's interesting, that approach you were taking. Do you want to expand a bit on the use of images?
Yeah, I mean, I find I tend to use them in the same way as I use written records and interrogate them with the same level of suspicion about their accuracy. I think famously, Malton has one image, I think, of Trinity, which he couldn't possibly ever have seen because he'd have had to be somewhere in the middle of what is now the Bank of Ireland, which has no windows looking out in it.
Yes.
So there is an element of that sort of skepticism, but it's in the same way as you look at every written record and think, well, who's writing it? What's their bias? Who are they writing it to? What's their bias? Are they in the pay of someone? And it's, I think, just another layer that you then add on. And increasingly for publications, you can or are allowed to use images. Sometimes they can be expensive, but there is, I think, an increasing willingness of publishers to allow at least black and white images. Otherwise, you end up having to describe them, which is much more challenging. Say you want to describe the fashions of the day. And one of the things I really like about those things is when you're talking about, someone's talking about sort of the setting up of promenading around Stephen's Green. But at one point where women were promenading around that, they would have been walking on mud. And so you've got these like fine fashions, but you also know from various illustrations and written accounts that they'd be traipsing through mud. And so it just gives you a much greater sense of, what was going on, what it was like to actually live at the
Yes.
time and not just report back on it. It's one of those things of, if you read only, say, what the laws were, if
Yes.
you read them today, and you read, you can drive 50 kilometers an hour in this road, on this road, and you would read that and go, okay, well, everyone did that. But we know, living in this, that is not the case. So you always have to think, well, these are laws, but we can't assume that they're always being
Is this full
adhered to.
reality?
Is it the full
Absolutely.
reality? And everyone's reality, even, if Kieran and I discuss what happens at this talk, it'll be a different reality. So I really like the use of images to help bolster, what you were talking about.
I agree. And even where you were showing the cartouche from County Cork, from the map, that Cork map from 1811, it's very much how the city wanted to portray itself. It's a bit like if we took family photographs at Christmas, whatever, or family photographs of any special occasion, we're dressed up and we're in the good room, we're standing in front of the best part of the garden. So it's very much how we want to portray ourselves. And that
Yeah.
tells you a lot as well. It tells you what they valued about themselves, or what they felt was desirable, or received public approval. Just taking on to another question here, what discoveries do you think could come from a project like the Virtual Treasury? We might share this ourselves, actually, Gillian. What discoveries could come from a project like the Virtual Treasury? What opportunities do you think there are for researchers, both casual and academic? So I'll take the what could be discovered, and then maybe bounce to you for how might these be used. So it is very necessarily random by its nature what has survived. So we might suddenly stumble upon, or an archivist or a librarian might suddenly tell us about a collection which is directly relevant and we never knew it existed before, and we will negotiate and include that, like we've included the TNA records. But then what researchers, both local historians, amateurs, professionals, all sorts, will make of this is very much what, sort of onto Gillian's side, and the students you work with, Gillian, I think as well, how you can kind of put materials in front of them. Any comment on how, like, if a new set of records, I say new to the website, if a new to the website set of records became available on any given topic, let's invent a topic, how might you use them, or how might you encourage your students to use them?
Well, I think one of the great joys, I think there's a great joy in going into an archive and sitting holding the papers, and you go in, you call up,
Yes.
you go in and look at one collection, and you work your way through that. But what I think the virtual treasury does, but also the digitization more broadly in other archives, but the virtual treasury does this very nicely, whereas you can put in a phrase, a term, an event, an individual, or whatever, into the search engine, and it'll bring you up all of those links. So you might find the same individual. There's a court case around about them. There's a will around them. There's a something else. So you, in a ways that you might not if you just went into the archive, you suddenly find a whole broad scope of connected pieces at your fingertips.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things I would caution about is, if you start digging, you might not leave your computer for quite a long time. I mean, you can
Yes.
absolutely get stuck. And this was me for like, well, I could have spoken for hours to try and kind of, because you keep
Yeah.
following down one rabbit hole going, I'll just check one more thing. So it's
Agree.
endless. And it can spark sort of a thing that might bring you off to the National Archives in London or National Archives in
Yep.
Dublin, having to physically go there, but it's a really good starting place to
Yeah.
begin a project, or to add to a project you're already doing.
I think that start thing is really important. For instance, there's a person inquiring here, are there military and naval records accessible? On the Virtual Record Treasury, not particularly. Those records were very often held in London with the War Office in London. So they were while some were lost in 1922 in Dublin, the great majority would have survived and are still today in the National Archives in Kew, although some were subsequently destroyed by enemy fire by enemy bombardment in the Second World War. But it's the using, as I think as Gillian, you're talking to there, it's using some online resources, and it might lead you to a physical archive. You might go to TNA or use TNA's own catalogue, or end up in some local or regional archive, where you, once you begin to the thread, getting some nice praise for your infectious enthusiasm and expertise, Gillian, from some listeners. There's a question here, are there equivalents of the satirical portraits of Hogarth et al., and relevant specifically to Ireland in this period? I think some do exist. They're not in the virtual treasury, but I've seen comic cartoons about Ireland. Gillian, any
Yeah,
university
there
tend
are
to?
absolutely loads of them.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, a lot of them were published in British periodicals, but there are huge numbers of them. Nicholas Robinson is the expert on those sort of political cartoons.
Yeah.
He's published extensively, and actually, if you look at, and this is not virtual treasury, Trinity College have digitized a lot of them, and if you go onto their website and put in Nicholas Robinson or political cartoons, you'll bring up a whole range of them. Now he has a particular focus in range. Felix Larkin's also done
Yes.
work.
Yes.
But I would start with Nicholas Robinson's collection, and
And
that's through Trinity College.
And there's a whole range of work done on Punch, so Punch the magazine,
Yeah,
Punch, Paddy and Mr.
it's all
Punch,
digitized.
that notion of Irish characters and Irish tropes within Punch being the British magazine. The question here, which I'll take, what's the best way to search for wills on the virtual treasury? And the wills collections that we have, the ones that Gillian was referring to, they're part of the PROB 11, so Probate 11 series within the TNA. So if on our website, on Virtual Treasury website, if you actually just put in PROB, the number 11, and that should bring you to a collection, or you can browse to the National Archives UK's collection and scroll down through the browse headlines to see PROB 11, and you'll find the wills in there. The last question, maybe before just we wrap up here, this is also interesting. Are there any books you'd recommend about this period, especially to avoid the big man history? Now, modesty might prevent you from talking about your own book, but let's forgo modesty and see, to do non-big man history, what social history and that sort of regular, ordinary people, as you say, inverted commas. Any suggestions for reading?
Well, obviously, I would recommend my book, I'm afraid, The Darkness
Yes,
Echoing, which
very
isn't
good.
just about 19th century Ireland, but definitely tries to avoid the big man history, or at least if it does it from taking a very sideline
Yeah,
view, because for The Darkness Echoing, it was around looking at how Ireland deals with its bleak past. But there's that. It's quite hard to avoid big man history in any of the sort of
yes,
sweeping books. This is a terrible thing to say that I can't off the top of my head. John Gibney's short history of Ireland is quite good at that, but it
yes,
does also quite heavily look at the big man history. So maybe I've written
yeah.
the only one that doesn't. That would be
That's good.
marvelous.
You could be the starting point. You could be the starting point for
Yeah.
this. This is excellent. Very good. Um, okay, we're just coming towards the last minute there now, so I'll just remain to thank you, Gillian, for that. It was really most fascinating to see the long 19th century through the eyes of these individuals, so thank you for that. This was the final talk in the Finding Ireland series, but there is good news. If you missed any of the talks, that's talks over medieval, early modern, and today modern or 18th century and 19th century Ireland. If you missed any of the talks, there's the opportunity to watch them again for another week until Sunday, 12th of October. They'll be available online, and a link to view those online will be popped into the Q&A where you can do that. You'll also receive an email after this talk with that same link. So I'd like to thank Gillian again for a wonderful talk, and thank our behind the scenes team for all the support, and to everybody at home for joining us. Thank you very much.